The house my mother bought me. It was a Tuesday, and I had come home from the office almost 3 hours earlier than usual. From behind the bedroom door, I heard it. A strange, ragged breathing, like someone struggling to pull air into their lungs. The instant I reached for the handle to throw the door open, a small, work-roughened hand closed around my wrist with a strength I never would have guessed she had. "Ma'am, you cannot open that door, not like this." It was Odette, the woman who cleaned my house twice a week and who, in 11 months of scrubbing my floors and folding my daughter's laundry, had never once raised her voice to me. There are women in this world who want nothing more than a quiet house and a dinner table where everyone is still talking and laughing when the meal is over. Women who spend their whole lives believing that if they just choose the right man and are patient enough and giving enough, the house will hold. But life does not always pay patience back with peace. Sometimes the more you bend, the more people learn that you will always bend. And the longer you stay quiet to keep things smooth, the more you get treated like something to be stepped over on the way to the refrigerator. They say sometimes you have to lose a small fight to win the larger war. I understand that saying. I even believed it once. But if all that losing, all that swallowing, is done so that everyone else can be comfortable while your own chest is being hollowed out night after night, I have to ask, is there really any virtue in it at all? I used to think a wife's whole job was to be the flexible one. I thought that loving a family meant absorbing its flaws quietly, the way a rug absorbs footprints. It wasn't until I was standing in my own hallway that Tuesday afternoon, my hand an inch from a doorknob, that I understood something that has never left me since. If I had let my anger win in that moment and thrown that door open, another woman's entire life might have ended up buried under a lie that was never hers to carry. But I need to back up, because none of it, the breathing behind that door, Odette's hand locked around my wrist, the hidden camera, the ambulance, any of it makes sense unless you understand how a 35-year-old woman with a mortgage nearly paid off and a good job and a healthy dose of common sense ends up standing outside her own bedroom, too afraid of a trap to open her own front door. My name is Claire. I'm 35 and I work as a senior accountant for a logistics company headquartered just south of downtown Nashville. Because my job is built around finding the one number that doesn't reconcile, the one line item that's been quietly padded, people who don't know me well tend to describe me as guarded, careful, a little cold maybe at first. I've heard the word robotic more than once, usually from men who wanted something from me that the math didn't support. I've made my peace with that reputation. When you lose the one person who unconditionally has your back before you're even 30 years old, you learn fast that carefulness isn't coldness. It's what keeps the roof over your head. I got married at 28. My husband, Nathan, was 2 years older and worked as an electrical contractor. The kind of man who could rewire a whole house himself, but still got quietly proud every time he successfully assembled a piece of flat-pack furniture. When we were dating, he wasn't a big talker. He didn't do happy hours with the guys from his crew. He was the sort of man who, on his way home from a 12-hour job, would stop at the grocery store and pick up a head of broccoli and a couple of chicken thighs because he'd noticed my fridge was empty. I still remember one night I was working past 10 on a quarter-end close. He showed up in the lobby of my office building, soaked from the rain, holding a paper bag with a container of soup from the Vietnamese place around the corner. He didn't make a big production out of it. He just handed it to me and said, "Eat something. You're not a server rack, Claire. You'll crash eventually, just like everything else that runs too hot." That stupid, half-joking comparison, it was such an engineer's way of being tender, undid something in me that I'd kept locked up since my mother's funeral. At the time, I owned a small one-bedroom condo in the Gulch, the kind of place young professionals in Nashville fight over at open houses. The mortgage was nearly paid off. It wasn't glamorous. The kitchen was the size of a walk-in closet, and the balcony was really just wide enough for 2 pots of basil and a folding chair. But it was mine, built brick by financial brick out of years of skipped vacations and reheated leftovers eaten alone at my desk. More than that, it was built out of my mother's last gift to me. My mother died about 14 months before my wedding. She'd been a labor and delivery nurse for 30 years, the kind of woman who could calm a screaming newborn and an exhausted new father in the same breath. And she'd quietly put money aside her entire working life without ever once telling me how much. It wasn't until the hospice nurse handed me a folder of paperwork that I understood she'd been saving, in her own stubborn, undramatic way, for exactly this, so that her daughter would never have to depend on anyone for a roof over her head. Near the end, her hand had gone thin as a dry twig, the veins standing up under skin that had lost its color. She gripped my fingers with whatever strength was left in her and said, "Claire, baby, when you get married, and you will, you're too soft-hearted not to. You're going to have to learn patience. Real patience. The kind that doesn't keep score every day. But listen to me. Don't ever let your patience get so big that people forget you're allowed to be treated decently. There's a difference between bending and disappearing." At the time, I thought she was just worried about me marrying without a big family standing behind me, and I cried and told her I understood. I had no idea that her words would become the one thing that kept my head above water years later, when the storm she'd somehow predicted actually arrived. After the wedding, Nathan moved into my condo. I never once made him feel small about that. I still believe, that a home isn't defined by whose name got there first, but by the life 2 people build inside it together. I never waved the deed around or acted like I was doing him a favor. I simply thought it made sense, since I'd bought the place before we met, and it held every dollar my mother had left me, for the title to stay in my name alone. I figured that if we were upfront about that from day one, there'd never be a reason for it to become a problem. But peaceful stretches never last as long as you want them to. About 3 months into the marriage, Nathan's mother, Estelle, came up from a small town in East Tennessee to stay with us. She was 63 then, a small, tidy woman who always had her gray-streaked hair pinned up neatly, and she had a way of saying, "I don't need much at my age. Just seeing my kids happy is plenty for me," that made you feel almost guilty for hesitating. She told us the house out in the country had gotten too quiet since Nathan's father passed, that the sound of wind against the tin roof at night made her feel like the last person left on earth. Nathan, clearly uneasy about the idea of his mother alone out there, turned to me one evening and said, "What would you think about Mom staying with us a while? Place could use a little more life in it. And once we start having kids, it'd be good to have help around." I sat with that for a few seconds and then nodded. It wasn't extraordinary generosity on my part. I just couldn't stomach the idea of a son leaving his widowed mother by herself in an empty house. I also, foolishly, believed that if I was warm enough to her, she'd come to feel something like affection for me in return. I thought kindness was a debt that eventually got repaid. It was a very naive time in my life. On the day Estelle arrived, I made up the guest room myself. Fresh linens, a small reading lamp with a warm bulb, a vase of grocery store tulips on the dresser. She stood in the doorway, looked around, and beamed. My daughter-in-law has such good taste. This room is lovely. Nathan really did find himself a good one. Those words sat warm in my chest for days. When we ran into neighbors in the elevator, she'd brag about me without any prompting. Our Claire. She works full-time and still keeps this whole house running like clockwork. It's like I got a second daughter out of the deal. But here's something I learned that I wish I hadn't had to learn firsthand. Some compliments are sugared on the outside and leave a bitter film on your teeth once you've actually chewed and swallowed them. Out in public, in earshot of anyone who mattered, I was her daughter. Behind our own front door, once the deadbolt clicked shut, her words started to develop small, deliberate thorns. One evening, I was at the kitchen table finishing up the paperwork for our final mortgage payment. Estelle was across from me, snapping the ends off green beans for dinner, and she glanced over at the papers without really trying to hide that she was reading them. "Is this place still just in your name, Claire?" "It is," I said. "I bought it before Nathan and I got married. We've got a few payments left, and then it's paid off free and clear." She made a small sound in her throat and kept snapping beans, a little harder than before. "When a woman marries into a family, she becomes part of that family. It isn't right to hold on to things so tight. You start thinking mine and his all the time. A marriage can't hold together like that." I kept my voice even. "I understand what you're saying, Estelle. I just think it's cleaner for everyone if the paperwork stays clear." She set the colander of beans down on the table with more force than the moment called for. Young people today. Always so clever about dividing everything up so neat and tidy. When I married Nathan's father, there was no such thing as yours and mine. We just had ours. I didn't answer. The pot of chili on the stove was starting to bubble, sending up a warm, spiced steam that filled the kitchen. And still, I felt a strange draft cut across the back of my neck, like someone had left a window open somewhere in the house that I hadn't noticed. That night, I mentioned it to Nathan while he scrolled through a materials order on his phone. He laughed it off without really looking up. "That's just Mom. Old school thinking, that's all it is. You don't need to let it get under your skin. What matters is we're all getting along, right?" I looked at him and thought, if getting along really mattered to you, why won't you say one firm sentence to your own mother? But I didn't want to sour the mood of our still new marriage over one uncomfortable comment, so I let it go. After Estelle moved in, the condo started changing in small, almost undetectable ways. The blue glass vase I loved on the dining table got put away because it was in the way. The mismatched mugs I'd collected from thrift stores over the years got pushed to the very back of the cabinet, replaced by a matching set Estelle had brought from home. Dinner started being planned around what Nathan and his mother liked, and if I ever gently mentioned a preference, I could feel the room quietly deciding I was being difficult. You have to compromise when you're living together, I told myself. Don't be the petty one. But compromise that only ever flows in one direction isn't compromise. It's a hallway that keeps getting narrower, and the farther you walk down it, the harder it is to remember where the door out used to be. One afternoon, I came home from work early and heard Estelle out on the balcony, talking low into her phone, clearly not expecting anyone to be back yet. I know the deed's still in Claire's name, but if they stay married long enough, it'll all end up being Nathan's eventually. I'm working on it slow, don't you worry. I was standing in the shadow of the kitchen doorway with 2 grocery bags cutting into my fingers, and my stomach dropped the way it does when you miss a step on a staircase in the dark. Estelle turned, saw me, flinched for a half second, and then smiled like nothing at all had happened. "Oh, welcome home. What'd you pick up?" I managed to smile back, though my mouth had gone completely dry. Chicken thighs and some sweet potatoes. Dinner that night was roasted chicken and mashed sweet potatoes and a salad, and Estelle set a warm, tender piece of chicken on my plate like she always did. Nathan asked if I was tired from work, gentle as ever. From the outside, it would have looked like the most ordinary, contented family dinner in America. Only I knew that from the moment I'd heard the words, "I'm working on it slow," this small condo had stopped being a safe nest that belonged to my husband and me. In Estelle's mind, it had become a prize that was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up to what she'd already decided was true. That night I stood out on the narrow balcony for a long time. The October air was sharp enough to sting, and down below, ordinary Nashville life kept unfolding the way it always does. People walking dogs, a couple laughing on their way into a restaurant, string lights strung along a rooftop bar a few blocks over. Somewhere in this same city, in this home I had built with my own overtime hours and my mother's careful savings, I suddenly felt like a stranger who had to think twice before she moved a coffee mug 6 inches to the left. I missed my mother so much in that moment that my throat physically ached. If she'd still been alive, she would have told me not to jump to conclusions too fast. That you learn who someone really is over time, not in one overheard phone call. But Mom, at that point in my life, I still believed that my husband's family was automatically my family too. I thought if I just stayed kind long enough, Estelle would come to treasure me the way she claimed to in front of the neighbors. I understand now that resentment in a house doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come crashing through the front door. It creeps in through offhand jokes at dinner, through a certain look exchanged across the table, and only once it's already swallowed half the light in the house does it finally show its actual shape. From the day I overheard that phone call, I started living carefully in my own home, watching my own footing the way you do on ice. It wasn't that my feelings for anyone had changed overnight. It was that something in me had been cut, quietly and precisely, and after that, even small things made me flinch. Still, life doesn't pause just because your chest has a new bruise in it. I went to work in the mornings. I came home and cooked in the evenings. Estelle sat at the table trimming vegetables, humming to herself. Nathan came home smelling like sawdust and copper wire. It's probably just an old woman's way of talking, I told myself. I just need to let it go. I tried for a while to believe that. Then came the evening a heavy Tennessee thunderstorm rolled through Nashville, and with it came the second earthquake in my marriage. I was in the kitchen making pot roast, an omelet on the side for Sophie because she'd decided that week she only wanted eggs for dinner, and a plain green salad nobody but me would touch. My 8-year-old daughter was coloring at the little table in the living room, and Estelle kept glancing at the clock and then toward the front door, restless in a way I couldn't place. "Are you expecting someone, Estelle?" She wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "Oh, Renee mentioned she might swing by for a bit." Before I could ask anything else, the intercom buzzed, sharp and insistent. Nathan opened the door, and a gust of storm-cold air blew in along with his younger sister, Renee, dragging 2 enormous suitcases and a duffel bag hanging off one shoulder. Behind her stood her 7-year-old son, Milo, soaked through, clutching a rain-drenched stuffed dinosaur like it was the only solid thing left in his world. Renee was 33, 4 years younger than Nathan. I'd heard secondhand in vague fragments that she'd been living about an hour outside the city and had recently split from her husband, but nobody had ever filled me in on the details. Her face was blotchy from crying, her bangs plastered flat to her forehead. And yet, the first words out of her mouth weren't the words of someone arriving in genuine crisis. "Estelle, I am so sorry to just show up like this. I got divorced and I have literally nowhere else to go. I know this is a huge imposition. If we're a problem, Milo and I will turn right back around and leave. I was standing in the middle of my own kitchen, holding a spatula, and I couldn't help the short, disbelieving breath that escaped me. I hadn't said a single word yet. She'd already framed the scene so that if I hesitated for even a second, I'd be the cruel, cold-hearted wife who turned a mother and child out into a thunderstorm. Estelle rushed over and hauled the suitcases inside herself. "Oh, you poor thing. A woman goes through a divorce and the whole world just piles on. This is your brother's house, too. Nobody here is going to complain about that. Don't you worry about a thing. Just go rest. Nobody here is going to complain." Estelle's voice was gentle, but the glance she cut toward me out of the corner of her eye was made of ice. Nathan looked at me, visibly uncomfortable. "Claire, Renee just got divorced. She packed up in a panic and came straight here. Can we let her stay with us a little while? Just until she's back on her feet?" Half hidden behind his shoulder, Milo was scanning the unfamiliar living room with wide, anxious eyes. Whatever was happening between the adults, none of it was that child's fault. I thought about a woman pushed out of her own home on a stormy night, dragging her son by the hand with nowhere to go, and something in my chest softened despite everything my instincts were telling me. I gave a stiff nod. "Come in and get out of those wet clothes first. We'll figure the rest out after everyone's eaten." Renee didn't offer a single word of thanks. She just let out a heavy, put-upon sigh and hauled her suitcases into the spare room like she already owned it. That night, I made up the spare room for her and Milo myself, using the good sheets I'd bought when Estelle first arrived. I found a spare towel and a new toothbrush and warmed a glass of milk for Milo. While Renee unpacked, I told her gently, "If you need anything else tomorrow, just say so. Take your time deciding whether you want to look at schools for Milo here in the city or go back closer to where you were." She sat on the edge of the bed, eyes suddenly glassy. "I don't even know yet. My ex was... he was something else. I basically got tossed out with nothing to my name. This kid is all I have left." Hearing that, I did feel a genuine ache of sympathy for her. We were never going to be close, but I could imagine, as one woman to another, exactly how a marriage falling apart could hollow a person out. I handed her the warm milk, and she murmured, without looking up, "Thanks, Claire." Up until that point, I honestly believed that a couple extra people in the house wasn't going to be a huge deal. I didn't mind cooking a little more rice. She was my husband's sister, after all. But what Renee described as a few days quietly turned into weeks, and then months. For the first 3 days, she helped around the house and seemed to be watching how I'd react to things. By day 4, she was sleeping until early afternoon, blaming insomnia brought on by the shock. Milo ran wild from the living room to the kitchen, toys scattered across every walkable surface, a plastic dinosaur wedged under the couch, action figures littering the hallway. One evening, carrying a pot of hot chili to the table, I nearly went down over a small plastic block left directly in the walkway. I crouched to Milo's level and said gently, "Hey, buddy, let's put your toys back in the bin when you're done playing, okay? It's not safe to leave them where people walk." Before Milo could even respond, Renee's voice cracked sharp from the next room. "Milo, stop that! You're going to get in trouble with your aunt!" Then, to me, "Claire, I'm sorry. He's been a mess emotionally since his dad left. He can't even pick up after himself right now. It's on me as his mom. But could you maybe not glare at him like that?" I hadn't glared at anyone. I'd asked a 7-year-old, as calmly as I would ask any child, not to leave sharp plastic toys in a walking path near a pot of scalding chili. But somehow, within the space of a single sentence, I'd become the villain of a scene I hadn't even chosen to be in. 3 weeks in, I finally worked up the nerve to raise the subject of money. Not out of spite. Our grocery bill had nearly doubled, the water bill had jumped, and I was still covering the mortgage, the insurance, the utilities, and now, apparently, groceries for 6 people instead of 3. One evening after dinner, while Renee sat scrolling through her phone and Estelle wiped down the counter, I said, as evenly as I could manage, "I was thinking, since things are looking like there'll be a longer stay, maybe we could work out some kind of contribution toward groceries and utilities. Even something small would help." The kitchen went quiet in that particular way that tells you a grenade has just been rolled across the floor. Estelle set down her dish towel very deliberately. "Is that really something you need to bring up right now, with your sister-in-law going through the worst time of her life? Some things a family just absorbs. You've got a good job, Claire. Are you really going to sit there living your whole life dividing everything into yours and mine? If this is family, you need to learn a little grace." Nathan reached under the table and squeezed my hand, the universal gesture for, "Please don't make this into a thing." "Hey, Renee's going through a rough patch right now. Let's just help her out a while longer." "A while," I said. "How long is a while, exactly?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Until things stabilize for her." Renee, drying her hands with more force than the task required, shot back, her voice sharp with wounded pride. "Wow, it's because we're here that everything's such a hassle for you, is that it? Fine. I don't want to be a burden on you and my own brother. Milo and I will just go tonight. We don't have anywhere else, but I guess we can figure out a bench at the bus station." Estelle flew to her daughter's defense, like I'd suggested leaving them on the highway. "What kind of nonsense is that? You have your brother's house right here. Where exactly would you go? As long as I am alive, nobody in this family is getting thrown out on the street." A short, hollow laugh climbed up my throat before I could stop it. I hadn't thrown anyone out. I hadn't said a single unkind word. I had asked, gently, for a small contribution to a household bill that had ballooned to cover 3 extra mouths. And somehow, in the span of one sentence, I had become the coldest, most calculating woman in the state of Tennessee. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood alone at the kitchen sink washing dishes, the water running colder than the tap should have allowed. In the living room, I could hear Estelle and Renee laughing together at something on television. My husband was on the couch, scrolling his phone, not offering to help the way he used to before all this started. The pale gray backsplash tile, the little basil plants on the balcony rail. This was the home I had bought with years of my own overtime and my mother's careful, silent saving. And yet I felt, standing there with soapy water up to my wrists, exactly like a caterer cleaning up after someone else's party had ended. I bent down and picked up a plastic fork Milo had dropped under the table. The floor near his usual seat was sticky with dried apple juice. As I wiped it clean with a rag, a thought settled into my chest with an almost physical weight. Maybe the moment you let people into your home out of pity is the exact same moment you hand them permission to look down on you. From the night Renee and Milo arrived, the quiet, ordered rhythm of our evenings, Sophie doing homework at her little desk, Nathan spreading blueprints across the coffee table, the steady sound of running water while I did the dishes, got shattered into pieces that never quite fit back together. Now there was always some reality show blaring from the TV, Milo shrieking as he ran laps around the living room, Renee sprawled across the couch, scrolling through live-stream shopping videos while claiming, whenever anyone asked, that she was actively job hunting. As a sister-in-law, I told myself to be patient. She's freshly divorced. I shouldn't push. But the more patience I offered, the more my in-laws seemed to treat my silence as something they were owed, rather than something I was choosing to give. The real fracture showed up at the dinner table, the way these things so often do. Since Renee's arrival, Estelle had gradually taken over the kitchen entirely. At first, I was almost grateful, thinking she was lightening my load. But once I actually paid attention to how the food got distributed, it was hard to unsee. The plumpest, best piece of chicken always ended up on Nathan's plate. The most tender cuts went into Milo's bowl. The perfectly cooked, golden half of the omelet landed in front of Renee without fail. "You need to keep your strength up after a divorce," Estelle would say. "We can't have people talking about how run down you look." Meanwhile, I'd be quietly working through a plate of under-seasoned mashed potatoes, listening to my own home being described again and again as though I were the guest inside it. One evening, I came home unusually late after closing out the month's books at the office. I opened the front door to the warm smell of stew and roasting meat, starving, already peeling off my coat as I headed for the table. Estelle, Renee, Milo, and Sophie were all seated, mid-meal. No matter how many times I scanned that table, there was no plate for me. I stood there, stranded in the middle of my own dining room. Sophie looked up first, her voice small. "Mom, sit by me, I'll get you a plate." As my daughter started to push back her chair, Estelle cut her off flatly. "You said you were working late, so I figured you'd be eating at the office. I can't exactly hold dinner for someone when I don't know what time she's coming home." Swallowing down the anger rising in my throat, I said as evenly as I could, "I got slammed today. I didn't have time to eat lunch either, Estelle." She didn't even glance my way, just tucked a piece of fish into Milo's mouth. "Then fix yourself something. You're a grown woman. How long is your mother-in-law supposed to wait on you hand and foot?" Renee snorted from across the table. "Claire works at some big fancy company. I guess she's used to people just having everything ready for her. Look at that face. All because one plate didn't get set out for her. In her own house." Without another word, I went to the cabinet and pulled down a plate myself. A cold bead of water dripped off it and landed on the back of my hand. I wiped it against my sleeve and sat down beside Sophie. The rice cooker held nothing but a scraped-out layer of burnt rice stuck to the bottom. The fish was down to bones. The stew pot had maybe 2 spoonfuls of broth left in it. Nathan finally spoke up, looking guilty. "Want me to throw a frozen pizza in the oven for you?" "You knew I hadn't eaten, didn't you?" It wasn't really a question. He didn't answer. The silence lasted only a second or two, but it wrapped around my throat like a wire. Sophie slid her own omelet over onto my plate. "Mom, eat mine." I slid it right back. "Mommy's not hungry, baby. You eat all of yours and grow big and strong." It was a blatant lie, and I couldn't stand the thought of taking food out of my own child's hands while she watched, in real time, the adults in her life quietly starve her mother out of a house that legally belonged to that mother alone. Later that night, after everyone else had finally gone to sleep, I stood in the kitchen microwaving a frozen container of mac and cheese. Sophie wandered out in her socks, hugging her stuffed rabbit, and watched my face for a long moment. "Mom, why didn't Grandma save you any dinner?" My hand froze around the noodle cup. Steam rose up and stung my eyes in a way that had nothing to do with steam. "Mommy came home late, sweetheart. Grandma probably just forgot." Sophie shook her head, very serious. "I told her you weren't home yet, but Aunt Renee said it's the late person's own fault, so I shouldn't worry about it." I turned my face away so my daughter wouldn't see it crumple. People love to say kids don't pick up on anything. The truth is the opposite. children register everything. They just don't yet have the vocabulary for the particular, sophisticated cruelty adults are capable of. From that night forward, Estelle stopped even bothering to disguise it. The cramped corner seat at the end of the table quietly became mine, permanently, while Renee claimed the good chair, the one that caught the breeze from the box fan on hot days. One evening, Estelle made a shrimp pasta, knowing full well I had a mild shellfish allergy. When I mentioned it, as gently as I knew how, the whole table turned on me at once. "How many mouths do you think are in this house?" Estelle snapped. "You expect me to cook around your one allergy? If you don't like it, go cook your own separate meal. When there's a lot of people in a family, you learn to go along with the majority." I laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. The majority? I've already given up basically everything to go along with the majority in this house. I'm still a member of this family, Estelle, not a decoration on the wall. She slammed her fork down hard enough to make the plates jump. "Is that any way to speak to your mother-in-law?" I held her gaze. "I'm asking for a place setting at the table. A single plate for every person eating dinner. Is that really an unreasonable thing to want?" Renee jumped in from the side, delighted to have an opening. "Claire, you're constantly holding it over everyone that this is your house. Honestly, it's exhausting. Making a whole scene because you didn't get a scoop of pasta? You're so petty. You might be great at balancing the books at your job, but at home you clearly can't stand the idea of your own daughter watching you get pushed around a little." A cold, brittle silence dropped over the table. Sophie went white and stared at her lap. Milo kept chewing, oblivious, sauce smeared across his chin. Nathan threw his fork down and sighed like I was the one being unreasonable. "Claire, come on, enough. It's one meal. One plate, what's the big deal? Mom didn't do it on purpose, just let it go." She didn't do it on purpose. That one sentence, delivered so casually, landed in my chest like a dropped brick. Once, maybe, is a mistake. Twice could be a misunderstanding. But when it happens over and over, day after day, at the exact same table, it stops being an accident and becomes a message. If it had happened to him, if he'd walked in to find the whole family eating and no plate anywhere for him, would he really have called it not a big deal? His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer that part. Estelle scoffed. "How dare you compare yourself to me? I am his mother. You are his wife. There's a difference, and you'd do well to show a little respect for it." My hand closed hard around my fork. On the outside, I'd always called her Estelle, always kept my tone level and polite. But something inside me was quietly cracking down the middle. I understood the hierarchy she was talking about perfectly well. What I didn't understand was how much longer I was supposed to eat dinner in my own home, feeling like an uninvited guest who'd overstayed her welcome. I knew I was crossing a line that had never been crossed before in that house. But when someone who has spent her whole marriage carefully reading the room finally stops reading it, the room tends to panic. Estelle shoved her chair back, rose halfway out of her seat, and pointed a finger at my face. This woman, lecturing her own mother-in-law. Let me tell you something. A married woman who doesn't know how to be humble? It doesn't matter how big her house is. That house is nothing but a cold, empty tomb. I didn't back down. The house isn't cold because I'm not humble enough, Estelle. It's cold because somebody keeps standing at this table, blowing an icy wind across it. Dinner ended in a silence broken only by the scrape of forks against plates. Nobody had shouted, and yet that thick, airless quiet was somehow worse than any yelling match could have been. Standing at the sink afterward, scrubbing plates that didn't need much scrubbing, I felt like the sponge in my hand was scraping something off the inside of my own rib cage. That night, Sophie crawled into my lap and squeezed my hand with her small fingers. "Mommy, when I grow up, I'm going to make sure you always get dinner." I held my daughter tight and said nothing, because I couldn't trust my voice. That one sentence from an 8-year-old cut deeper than any insult an adult in that house had managed to land on me. The worst wound a family can hand you doesn't always look like a slap or a slammed door. Sometimes it's something as small and deliberate as simply not setting out a plate. Portioning out the good food to everyone else, right in front of you, while you sit there and watch it happen. Petty, someone might say. A grown woman making a scene over a little food. But when you want to push someone out of a house without literally packing their bags for them, you don't need shouting. You just need to make them feel, quietly, every single day, like an unnecessary extra person in a place that was theirs long before anyone else moved in. In Estelle's eyes, and in Renee's, I had already stopped being family. I had become an obstacle standing between them and the deed to a condo they had already, in their minds, decided belonged to Nathan. After the plate incident, the temperature in that house dropped and never came back up. Estelle stopped even pretending to be warm toward me, and Renee started actively avoiding being in the same room. Conversations would cut off the second I walked into the living room. When I stepped into the kitchen, I'd catch the tail end of whispering that stopped a half-second too late. While they were busy treating me like I was invisible, every one of my senses was sharpening like a knife against a whetstone. It was a quiet, sophisticated kind of warfare, and I was only slowly starting to understand the rules. On a Sunday morning, while I was out on the balcony hanging laundry, Estelle called through the sliding door. "Claire, come sit down for a minute." Her tone was ordinary enough, but the way she was sitting bolt upright at the dining table wasn't. Nathan sat beside her, turning a glass of water in slow circles, wearing the carefully blank expression of a man who already knew what was coming and had decided not to fight it. Renee leaned back on the couch with her arms crossed, watching me the way you'd watch the opening scene of a show you already knew the ending to. I pulled out a chair. "What's going on?" Estelle looked at me steadily. "The mortgage on this place is almost paid off, isn't it?" "It is. 3 or 4 more payments." "Good." She nodded slowly, like she'd rehearsed this. "I've given this a lot of thought. And I believe that when a couple's going to spend the rest of their lives together, it's only right that the deed reflects both of their names. Put Nathan on it. Joint tenancy." For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" She repeated herself, slow and deliberate, like she was speaking to someone hard of hearing. "I said, put Nathan's name on the deed, too. A man is supposed to be the head of his household. It looks shameful, a house only in the wife's name, like my son's just living inside his wife's property." Renee jumped in before I could respond. "She's right, Claire. My brother's been living in this house for years, and it's still just your name on the paperwork. What is he, exactly? A tenant? At least renters have actual rights. My brother's just a husband in name only, basically." Nathan frowned. "Renee, that's enough." But that's where his objection ended. He didn't tell his mother to drop the demand. He didn't point out even once that this house had been bought entirely with my own money before we'd even met. He just sat there, letting his silence do all the talking his sister and mother wanted him to avoid. I took a slow breath. "Estelle, This condo is a home I bought with my own money, years before Nathan and I got married. The down payment came from money my mother left me. Under Tennessee law, that makes it my separate property. I have never once made Nathan feel unwelcome here, but the deed is staying in my name. She scoffed. Is there such a thing as my house, your house, between a husband and wife? A couple who splits everything up that neatly isn't a couple. They're business partners with a shared mailing address. Having clear financial boundaries doesn't mean we're not a family, Estelle. If anything, keeping things clear now means there's less to fight over later. She slammed her palm flat on the table. I cannot believe you have the nerve to lecture me about the law, in my own son's home, no less. It sends chills down my spine. In my day, when a woman got married, she gave her whole life over to her husband's family. But you women today, you earn a little money and suddenly all anyone can talk about is separate property and marital assets. It's ridiculous. I looked directly at Nathan. Do you think that too? That you're just a tenant in this house? He set his glass down. No, I've never thought that. Then why won't you say anything while your mother and sister sit here talking like it's already decided? He looked down at the table. Mom's not completely wrong, though. A lot of couples do joint tenancy. It's not like the deed would be going to some stranger. I'm your husband, Claire. Those words landed like a blade dipped in ice water. I asked, spacing each word out carefully. For you to be my husband, does your name legally need to be on that deed? Can't we just live with the trust between us being enough? He bit his lip and said nothing. Estelle pounced on the silence immediately. Look at this. The mother-in-law says one thing, and suddenly this woman's cross-examining her own husband like a courtroom prosecutor. It's only because Nathan's such a gentle soul that he puts up with you. Any other husband would have flipped this whole table by now. Renee clicked her tongue, delighted. Probably comes from working in accounting. She looks at people like they're line items on a spreadsheet. I bet my brother gets filed under miscellaneous expenses. In the past, I would have swallowed that comment whole and let it settle at the bottom of my stomach with all the others. That day, I didn't. Renee, it's exactly because I work in accounting that I know how to tell the difference between assets I earned myself and things other people are trying to talk themselves into believing they're owed. You've been living here rent-free for months. I've never once sent you an invoice. I've been cooking for your mother this whole time and never asked her for a dime toward groceries. Just because I don't send anyone a bill doesn't mean I haven't been keeping track. Renee shot up out of her seat. Are you seriously saying my son and I are trying to steal your house from you? Those are your words, I said evenly, not mine. The argument went in ugly circles for another 20 minutes before it finally burned itself out, the way arguments in that house always seem to. Not resolved, just exhausted. Nathan never once in the whole conversation said the sentence I needed to hear, that the deed would stay exactly as it was, and that was the end of the discussion. His silence told me everything his mouth wouldn't. Between my job and a house that had quietly ballooned from 3 people to 6, I was running on fumes. I left before sunrise most mornings and got home late at night with my eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets all day, and the cooking and cleaning, which had multiplied the moment Renee and Milo moved in, sat on my shoulders like an audit that never closed. I brought up the idea of hiring a part-time housekeeper to Nathan, and he agreed easily enough. Estelle, predictably, did not. There are 3 able-bodied women in this house, and you want to pay a stranger to clean it? The neighbors will laugh us out of the building. Back in my day, I worked the farm and raised 3 kids with these 2 hands, and nobody hired anybody to help me. I kept my voice soft but firm. I know you went through a lot, Estelle. That's exactly why I'd rather bring in some help now than have everyone burn out completely. Just a couple days a week. Renee, sprawled on the couch scrolling her phone, muttered without looking up. If you're paying for it, go ahead and hire whoever. I don't have money to put toward it. It wasn't even worth responding to. A few days later, a 58-year-old woman named Odette came through a referral from a coworker. She'd grown up in eastern Kentucky, was small and sun-weathered, with gray threading through dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, and she spoke in a calm, unhurried way that put me at ease almost instantly. She told me, without much drama, that she'd lost her husband young and had been supporting herself cleaning houses across Nashville, while her only son worked a job several states away. The day she started, she wiped her shoes carefully on the mat before stepping inside and greeted every single person in the house by name, like she'd already memorized us from a photograph. Ma'am, you just tell me what you need. I've worked plenty of houses with kids in them. I'll make sure your daughter's things stay neat and separate from everybody else's. Something in me loosened at those words in a way I hadn't expected. Odette turned out to be exactly as good as her word. She'd wipe down the stovetop and then double-check the stubborn grime in the corners of the sink that everyone else always missed. She kept Sophie's white school blouses washed separately from the dark laundry so nothing would bleed onto them. Sophie, for her part, adored her almost instantly. She'd run straight to Odette the second she got home from school, chattering before she'd even set down her backpack. Odette, I got 100 on my spelling test! Odette's weathered face would crease into a wide, genuine smile. Well, look at you. A girl who can write that clean this young is going to grow up thorough at everything she does. That plain, unpolished kind of praise, so much like something my own mother would have said, sometimes made my eyes sting without warning. Renee, meanwhile, had it out for Odette from the very first week. While Odette was wiping down the coffee table one afternoon, Renee snapped, Hey, ease up, it's not like it's your table. Why are you scrubbing it like you're trying to wear a hole in it? Odette went quiet, stopped, and simply said, You're right, I'll be more careful, and kept working. Another day, when Odette gently told Milo to put away the blocks he'd scattered across the hallway, Renee flew into a rage. Your job is to clean, not raise my kid. Stay out of it. When I started to step in on Odette's behalf, she gave me a small shake of the head, a quiet ask to let it go. I did anyway, once, saying evenly, Renee, she was probably just worried he'd trip over them. Renee huffed. Having a stranger in the house feels like being under surveillance 24/7. I hate it. I filed that comment away without fully understanding at the time exactly how much weight it was carrying. People who genuinely have nothing to hide don't usually flinch at being watched. One Saturday afternoon, while I was buried in inventory numbers at the office, my phone rang with Renee's name on the screen, her voice sharp and panicked. Claire, you need to come home right now. My gold necklace is missing. I grabbed a rideshare and walked into a full-blown scene in my own living room. Renee, eyes blazing, pointing a finger at Odette, who stood by the shoe rack near the front door, pale and visibly trembling. Estelle stood with her arms crossed, delivering her verdict like a judge. That 8-carat necklace Renee had in her purse is gone without a trace. The only outsider in this house is her. I set my bag down and asked, as calmly as I could manage, Renee, are you sure you put it in your purse this morning? She practically shrieked. You think I don't know where my own things are? I put it in there to wear out tonight, and now it's just gone. That necklace wasn't cheap. Estelle chimed in immediately. All I'm saying is, when there's an outsider's hand involved, you have to be firm about it. I'm not trying to be unkind. If you're not firm now, it only gets worse later. Ma'am, open your bag, right now. Odette's voice cracked as she pleaded. Ma'am, I swear to you, I did not take that necklace. I've lived a hard life, but I have never once touched something that wasn't mine. Renee sneered. Does a thief walk around with, I'm a thief, stamped on her forehead? If you've got nothing to hide, open the bag. I stepped in front of Odette, physically blocking them. We are not going through anyone's personal belongings without actual evidence. If we can't find it any other way, I have a camera set up in the living room. I'll check that first. If it's still nowhere to be found after that, we call the police. Renee's eyes went wide. Are you seriously taking a stranger's side over your own sister-in-law's? I'm taking the side of facts, Renee. If somebody accused you of theft with nothing to back it up, I'd stand up for you exactly the same way. Estelle slapped the arm of the couch. There's a thief standing in this house, and all this woman does is make excuses. This is exactly why I said not to bring strangers into a family home. I didn't dignify that with a response. I pulled up the small camera app on my phone, a nanny cam I'd installed months earlier, mostly for peace of mind whenever Sophie was alone in the living room, and started scrubbing back through the footage. Around noon, the recording showed Milo rummaging through Renee's purse, clearly hunting for candy. A moment later, something gold and glinting was clutched in his small fist, and he trotted straight toward the shoe rack by the front door. I crouched down to Milo's eye level. Hey, bud, can you tell me the truth? Did you take a necklace out of your mom's purse earlier to play with? He glanced nervously at Renee before answering in a barely there whisper. I thought it was like a magic necklace, like the robot uses to transform. I just played with it a little and put it in the shoe thing. Renee's face drained of every drop of color. I opened the shoe rack, tipped over one of Milo's small sneakers, and a crumpled gold chain fell out and landed on the floor with a soft, undeniable clink. The room went utterly silent. Odette pressed a hand to her chest, tears sliding down without a sound. I picked the necklace up off the floor and held it out to Renee. Here. It wasn't Odette, was it? Renee snatched it back, mumbling. Why is everyone acting like this over a kid's little prank? I just got scared because I thought it was actually stolen. Were you scared? I asked. Or did you decide she was a thief the second you couldn't find it? Renee turned her face away and offered nothing that even resembled an apology. Wasn't a simple I'm sorry just basic human decency, even as a formality? Estelle cleared her throat instead. Well, misunderstandings happen when people live under one roof. You won't hold a grudge over it, will you, Odette? Odette shook her head slightly, not meeting anyone's eyes. No, ma'am, I won't. But her hands were still shaking. For a woman with very little in this world, the worst thing isn't physical exhaustion. It's the particular injustice of being treated like a thief in someone else's house. Why is it so hard for people to understand that one careless, cruel accusation can sit on a person's back heavier than any amount of actual physical labor? Later that night, after everyone else had gone to their rooms, Odette found me in the kitchen and quietly told me she was thinking of resigning. Ma'am, you and Sophie are truly good people, but I don't think I can keep working in this house. My pride can't take much more of this. I set down the dish towel in my hands. Odette, please don't go. Not because of what happened today. I know exactly what it looks like from where you're standing, and I understand if you can't stay. But I want you to know I saw everything. I believed you before I even checked that footage. She studied my face for a long moment, and something in her posture eased, just slightly. I'll think on it, she said. And she stayed. I didn't know it yet, but that decision, hers to stay, mine to stand in front of her that afternoon, would end up being the single thread that saved my entire life a few months later. Winter came, and with it came something I hadn't expected, a strange, uneasy quiet. Estelle stopped bringing up the deed. Renee stopped picking fights over grocery money. For a few weeks, I let myself believe, foolishly, that maybe the worst of it had passed, that people really could soften with time the way I'd always hoped they would. I should have known better. In that house, silence was never peace. It was just the sound of a plan being built somewhere out of view. I found out what was actually happening by accident, the way you find out most things that people are working very hard to keep from you. I'd come home early on a Thursday to grab a folder I'd left on the kitchen counter, meaning to be in and out in under 5 minutes. Through the cracked door of the guest room, I heard Renee's voice, low and tight with stress, on a call. I told you I can't get you that kind of money right now. Vance, I don't have it. My brother's wife owns the place outright. There's no lien on it at all. If we can get even a chunk of it in Nathan's name, we could take out a home equity loan against it, and I could pay you back within the year, I swear. I stood frozen in the hallway, my folder forgotten entirely. No, she doesn't know anything. She'd never sign off on it voluntarily. That's the whole problem. Mom's got an idea. Just give us a few more weeks. I backed away from the door as quietly as I'd come and left the apartment without the folder at all. It took me 2 more days of careful, quiet digging to put together the full shape of it. Renee's ex-husband hadn't just been unfaithful, which was the story she'd told everyone from day one. He'd also run up a serious gambling debt in both their names before the divorce was even finalized. And when the marriage ended, the debt hadn't magically split evenly along with everything else. A man named Vance, who I eventually learned ran informal, high-interest loans out of a bar 2 towns over, considered the debt entirely Renee's problem now, and he was not the patient type. The number I overheard more than once was $175,000. Estelle knew. She'd known for months, possibly since before Renee had even shown up on our doorstep soaked from that first storm. And the plan the two of them had been quietly assembling wasn't really about family togetherness, or a man's dignity, or old-fashioned values about who should be head of a household. It was about my condo. Specifically, it was about getting Nathan's name onto that deed so they could take out a home equity loan against equity I had spent 8 years building and use my house, my mother's last gift to me, to bail Renee out of a debt she owed to a man who did not seem inclined to wait around for the money. I didn't confront anyone that week. I've never been the type to fly at a problem head-on before I understand its full shape, and something told me this particular problem had teeth I hadn't seen yet. Instead, I called a college friend named Priya Okafor, who'd gone on to become a family law attorney downtown, and asked to meet her for coffee on a Saturday when I could tell everyone at home I had a work commitment. I laid it all out for her. The deed pressure, the joint tenancy demand, the overheard phone calls, the debt. Priya listened without interrupting, stirring her coffee slowly. First things first, she said finally. As long as that deed stays solely in your name and you can document that the down payment and the bulk of the mortgage payments came from your own premarital funds, Tennessee law is squarely on your side. It's your separate property. Nobody can force you to add anyone to that title. Not your mother-in-law, not your husband, not a judge, unless you sign something voluntarily. That's what I thought. But I'm starting to think voluntarily is exactly the part they're planning to get around. Priya's expression sharpened. Then you need to be careful about two things. 1. Never, under any circumstances, sign anything in that house without reading every single line yourself, even if it's presented to you as something totally unrelated, a birthday card, a permission slip, anything. People trying to get a forged or coerced signature will sometimes slide the real document in between two harmless ones. 2. Start keeping copies of everything. Your mortgage statements, your bank records showing where the down payment came from, your mother's estate paperwork. Put copies somewhere outside that house. A safe deposit box, a friend's place, a cloud folder nobody else has the password to. I did exactly that over the following weeks, carefully, without telling a single soul in that house. I opened a small safe deposit box at my bank downtown and filled it with copies of the deed, the original closing documents from when I bought the condo at 26, my mother's estate paperwork, and screenshots of a few of the more damning conversations I'd managed to overhear or catch pieces of since. I told myself it was probably overkill. Some quiet, stubborn part of me, the part that had learned accounting specifically because numbers don't lie the way people do, kept doing it anyway. I also, without making a production of it, started keeping Sophie a little closer. I picked her up from school myself more often, instead of letting her ride the bus home to an empty afternoon, watched over by whichever adult happened to be paying attention that day. I didn't fully understand yet what I was protecting her from. I just knew. In the same instinctive way you know a storm is coming before the sky actually turns, that something in that house was building toward a moment I wasn't going to like. Nathan noticed none of it. If anything, that winter he seemed relieved that the fighting over the deed had quieted down, the way a man is relieved when an argument goes silent, without ever registering that silence itself can be a warning sign. He'd come home from job sites, eat dinner, half watch whatever was on TV, and go to bed, without ever once asking me how I was actually doing, whether the last few months had left any marks on me that didn't show. I used to think that not asking was simply obliviousness. Looking back, I think it might have been easier for him not to ask, because some part of him already suspected he wasn't going to like the honest answer. And he'd rather not know than have to choose a side. Odette, for her part, watched everything with the quiet, careful attention of a woman who had survived on paying close attention her whole life. She never said much about the family dynamics directly. It wasn't her place, and she knew it. But a few times that winter, while folding towels or wiping down the counters, she'd glance toward the guest room where Renee was on the phone again, voice pitched low, and something would tighten briefly around her eyes before she went back to her work without comment. I should have asked her, sooner than I did, exactly what she'd started noticing. I didn't, not yet. I was still, at that point, telling myself the worst of it might already be behind us. The legal route came for me first, and it came dressed as an accident. In early March, Nathan came home from work with a manila folder and set it on the kitchen counter like it was nothing. "Hey, can you sign this? It's just the renewal for the homeowner's insurance. The agent needs both our signatures since I'm listed as a resident now." I almost didn't even look closely. I was tired. Sophie needed help with a school project, and it would have been the easiest thing in the world to sign whatever was put in front of me without reading every line, the way I'm sure they were counting on. But Priya's voice was still fresh enough in my head. Never sign anything in that house without reading every single line yourself. So I sat down at the table, pulled the folder toward me, and actually read it. It wasn't a homeowner's insurance renewal. Buried under a genuine, mostly harmless insurance form on top was a second document, a quitclaim deed, already partially filled out, transferring a 50% interest in the condo from my name into joint ownership with Nathan. My signature line was flagged with a small yellow sticky arrow. My hands went very still. Nathan, what is this? He wouldn't quite look at me. Mom had a form drawn up. I told her I wasn't sure you'd go for it, but she said it wouldn't hurt to ask. And if you didn't want to sign it, you just wouldn't sign it. No harm done. You slid a legal document that transfers half my house underneath an insurance form and asked me to sign both at once without mentioning what one of them actually was. That's not asking, Nathan. That's exactly what it looks like. It's not that serious. Nobody forced anything. You caught it, you didn't sign it, so what's the problem? I looked at him for a long moment, searching for some sign that he understood what he'd just tried to help slide past me, and found nothing but mild irritation that I was making an issue out of it. The problem, I said slowly, is that you were willing to try. I didn't sign anything that night. I put both documents back in the folder, walked it straight to Estelle in the living room, and set it down in front of her without a word. She glanced at it, then at me, and for just a second, one unguarded second, something flickered across her face that wasn't embarrassment. It was closer to irritation that the attempt hadn't worked. I don't know what you're so upset about, she said finally. It was just a form. It was a quitclaim deed, Estelle. I know exactly what it was. I do this for a living. She didn't apologize. She never did. But something shifted in the house after that night. A subtle recalibration I could feel even if I couldn't name it yet. The direct approach, ask nicely, wear her down, slip it past her, had failed. And failed in a way that couldn't be walked back or laughed off. I had proof, now, sitting in a safe deposit box downtown, of exactly what they'd tried. If the legal route was closed, I understood. Some cold and clear-eyed part of me understood that a different kind of route would have to open in its place. I just didn't yet know what shape it would take. I found out, in pieces, over the following weeks. Renee had a coworker from her old job, a woman named Dana Whitlow, who I'd never met and only knew of because Renee occasionally complained about her on the phone. What I didn't know, what none of us in that house knew except Renee and, I'd later learn, Estelle, was that Dana had her own debt to the same man, Vance. A smaller one, but enough that she was desperate in her own right. Desperate enough, apparently, to agree to something in exchange for having a chunk of it forgiven. I want to be careful here because I've turned this part of the story over in my head more times than I can count, and I still don't think Dana deserves to be painted as a villain in it. She was a woman in a bad enough financial hole that when Renee came to her with an offer, show up at an apartment, wear something nice, have a few drinks, let things look a certain way for a camera that Dana was told, falsely, belonged only to Renee, and in exchange, a chunk of her debt to Vance would simply vanish. She said yes. She had no idea what she was actually walking into. She didn't know about me, or Sophie, or the deed, or any of the actual stakes on the table. She thought she was doing something sad and a little sleazy in exchange for financial relief, not becoming a prop in an elaborate scheme to blackmail a stranger out of her own house. I didn't know any of this yet, of course. What I knew, in April, was that the atmosphere in the house had shifted into something quieter and more watchful than open hostility had ever felt. Estelle was almost too pleasant. Renee started being unusually kind to Sophie, which put me on edge more than her open hostility ever had. And twice, coming home unexpectedly, I caught Renee on the phone with someone she referred to only as him. her voice dropping the second she noticed me in the doorway. The last piece fell into place because of Odette. One evening in late April, after everyone else had gone to bed, Odette found me folding laundry in the small utility nook off the kitchen and stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "Ma'am, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think you should know I've been keeping an eye on something, and I don't like the shape of it." I set down the shirt I'd been folding. "Tell me." "Renee's been on the phone a lot these last few weeks, with somebody she doesn't want anybody hearing about. And 2 days ago, when I was dusting in the hallway, I heard her and Estelle talking low in the guest room. I only caught pieces, but I heard your name, and I heard the word camera, and I heard something about you losing it on video." A cold, slow feeling spread through my chest. The same feeling I'd had standing in the kitchen doorway the day I overheard Estelle on the balcony saying, "I'm working on it slow." "Did you hear anything else? Anything specific?" Odette hesitated, clearly weighing how much of what she'd say next might sound like an accusation she couldn't fully back up. "I heard Renee say something about a woman coming by soon, and I heard Estelle say something about it being the easiest way to break her. I didn't understand it at the time. I still don't understand all of it. But ma'am, I've lived a long time, and I know the sound of people planning something they don't want witnessed. That's exactly what that sounded like." I stood very still in the small, cramped laundry nook, a folded shirt still in my hands, and felt something in me go quiet and sharp all at once, the way it does right before you make a decision you already know you can't take back. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I need you to do something for me, if you're willing. If you ever hear anything like that again, anything at all, I need you to write it down. Time, date, whatever you actually heard, word for word if you can manage it. Can you do that?" Odette nodded, her face set in the same steady, unflinching expression she'd worn the day I'd stood in front of her and refused to let Renee go through her bag. "I can do that, ma'am. I owe you that much and more." I went to bed that night beside a husband who had no idea his wife had just quietly recruited an ally inside his own mother's plan against her. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, going over every detail Odette had given me, turning it over and over the way I'd turn over a set of books that didn't reconcile, looking for the pattern underneath the noise. Something is coming, I thought. I don't know exactly what shape it's going to take, but I am not going to be standing there unprepared when it does. May arrived, and with it came our 4th wedding anniversary. I hadn't planned to make anything of it. The last year had worn down whatever romantic instincts I still had toward that particular date. But Sophie had gotten it into her head that her parents needed a date day, and had spent a week drawing a card with 2 stick figures holding hands under a lopsided heart. Something about that card, taped to the refrigerator where I saw it every morning while making coffee, softened something in me. I decided, almost on impulse, to leave work early that Tuesday and surprise Nathan by picking him up from his job site so we could grab dinner, just the 2 of us, before coming home to Sophie's card and whatever cake Odette had probably already helped her bake. I texted him around 1 in the afternoon. No response. I texted again at 2. Still nothing. Which wasn't entirely unusual. He often had his phone buried in a work bag on job sites with bad reception. But something about the silence sat wrong in my stomach in a way I couldn't immediately explain. By 2:30, I found myself telling my manager I had a family matter and needed to leave early, which wasn't exactly a lie. I stopped at a bakery near the office and picked up a small anniversary cake, mostly out of stubbornness at that point, some determination to make the day mean something, even if the day itself seemed determined not to cooperate. By the time I pulled into the parking garage under our building, it was just past 3 in the afternoon, hours earlier than anyone in that house would have expected me home. The lobby smelled like rain even though it hadn't rained, someone's wet umbrella dripping by the elevator bank probably. I remember the elevator ride up feeling unusually long, the numbers ticking past too slowly, my own reflection in the brushed steel doors looking tired and a little hopeful, a combination I hadn't worn in months. I let myself in with my key, cake box balanced against one hip, already composing the sentence I was going to say to Sophie about a surprise for later. The apartment was quiet, in a way that struck me as slightly off before I could articulate why. No television on, no sound of Milo running through the hallway, none of the usual low hum of a house with 6 people in it. And then I heard it. From behind the closed bedroom door, our bedroom, the one Nathan and I had shared since our first year of marriage, came a sound like ragged, struggling breathing, uneven and strained, in a way that didn't sound like anything I wanted to walk into unprepared. I set the cake box down on the entry table without really deciding to, my hand already moving toward the doorknob, my mind already racing ahead to a dozen terrible, half-formed conclusions. I got exactly as far as touching the handle before a small, work-roughened hand clamped around my wrist with a grip far stronger than I would have guessed a 58-year-old woman capable of. "Ma'am, you cannot open that door." Odette's face, when I turned to look at her, had gone the color of old paper. Her eyes were wide, darting once toward the bedroom door and back to me, and there was something in her expression I'd never once seen on her in the 11 months I'd known her. Pure, unfiltered fear. "Odette, let go. Something's wrong in there. I need to—" "Ma'am, please." Her grip didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened. "Ma'am, it's a trap. I'm begging you, do not open that door." The word trap landed in my chest like a dropped stone. Everything Odette had told me back in April. The whispered conversations, the word camera, the word breaking her, came rushing back all at once. No longer abstract warnings, but something suddenly, terrifyingly concrete, happening on the other side of a door I'd nearly just thrown open. I pulled my hand back, but I didn't reach for the knob again. "Tell me, now, everything." Odette's words came out in a fast, shaking rush, like she'd been holding them behind her teeth for hours, waiting for exactly this moment. A woman came by around 1. Renee let her in through the service entrance so the front desk wouldn't log a visitor. I didn't recognize her, young, maybe late 20s, real nervous the whole time. Renee gave her something, some kind of drink, said it was to relax her nerves. I don't know what was in it, ma'am, but that girl went from jittery to barely able to stand inside of 20 minutes. And then Renee and Estelle walked her into your bedroom together and locked the door from the outside. My whole body had gone cold and very, very still. Locked her in. With Nathan. Nathan came home around noon, ma'am. I don't think he knew what he was walking into any more than that poor girl did, but I can't say that for certain, and I won't pretend I can. What I do know is there's a camera set up in there, small one, tucked behind the tissue box on the dresser. I saw Renee testing the angle on it yesterday when she thought nobody was watching. It's not pointed at the bed, ma'am. It's pointed at the door. I stood in my own front hallway, cake box forgotten on the entry table, and felt the entire shape of the last 6 months finally click into a picture I could see clearly for the first time. The insurance folder, with the quitclaim deed hidden underneath, the debt to Vance, the word breaking her. None of this had ever been about an affair at all. It had been engineered, staged, built specifically for this exact moment. For me to come home, hear something alarming, throw that door open in a wave of grief and fury, and get caught on camera doing something that could be edited, narrated, or simply threatened into looking like the unraveling of an unstable, violent wife. Something they could wave in front of my employer, or a judge, or anyone else whose opinion of me mattered, until I signed whatever they needed me to sign just to make the threat disappear. If I give in to the anger right now, I thought, my hands trembling but my mind suddenly strangely clear, I lose. Whatever happens next, I am not going to be the woman in their video. The bedroom door burst open before I could decide my next move, and Renee stumbled out, her face pale and her hands visibly shaking despite the sneer she forced onto her mouth. "Claire, what are you doing just standing out here? Sounds like your husband's in there cheating on you and you're not even going in to check? Open the door. Go on, look." Right behind her came Estelle, hair coming loose from its usual neat pin, her voice pitched loud enough to carry down the hallway. "What is all this commotion? Claire, are you really going to throw another fit because you don't trust your own husband?" Another fit. As if I had a documented history of hysterics they could point to. As if this were a pattern instead of the first time in 4 years of marriage I'd ever come anywhere near this door with anything other than exhaustion on my mind. Their panicked eyes, the way they were both actively trying to steer me toward that doorknob with their whole bodies. It was, in its own twisted way, exactly the confirmation I needed. Every word Odette had told me in the hallway a minute earlier suddenly had a face attached to it. 2 faces, standing right in front of me, working overtime to get me to do the one thing that would ruin me. From inside the bedroom, a thin, frightened sound leaked out. A woman's voice, slurred and disoriented. The kind of sound a person makes when their body is trying to fight through something it shouldn't have been given in the first place. I clenched my shaking hands into fists at my sides and made myself take one slow breath and then another. I will not move according to their script. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Renee lunged toward me like she could physically stop the call from connecting. "Are you insane? Why are you calling the police?" I stepped back out of her reach and kept my voice level, almost unnervingly calm even to my own ears. "There's a person in that room who sounds like she's in medical distress. Of course we're calling an ambulance and the police. You're the one who just told me it might be an affair, Renee. Fine. Let's open that door with police standing right here to witness whatever we find." The dispatcher's voice came on the line, and I gave our address, described a possible medical emergency and a locked door, and asked for both police and paramedics. My voice didn't shake once. I remember being almost surprised by that, distantly, the way you notice small, strange details in the middle of something enormous, and how steady my own hands had suddenly become. The second the call ended, I dialed the building's front desk. "This is Unit 1214. I need building security and the property manager up here immediately. There may be a person being held against her will in my apartment, and I've already called the police. I need witnesses present before that door gets opened. If I open it myself without anyone else here, I'm worried I'll be the one blamed for whatever's inside." 5 minutes later, my quiet Tuesday afternoon had turned into something out of a different life entirely. Sirens rose up from the street below, and then the sound of the elevator, and then my front door, which I'd left propped, filled with 2 uniformed police officers, a pair of paramedics with a gurney, our building's head of security, and the property manager, a man named Mr. Castellano, who I'd exchanged maybe 10 total sentences with in 3 years of living there. A few doors down the hall, I noticed neighbors' heads poking out, drawn by the sirens, murmuring to each other behind cupped hands. Estelle collapsed dramatically onto the hallway floor, wailing loud enough that I was fairly sure the whole building could hear her. "My daughter-in-law has lost her mind, calling the police on her own husband. Has anyone ever heard of anything so shameful in their entire life?" One of the officers, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and an expression that suggested she'd seen every version of this scene before, turned to me directly. "Ma'am, are you the one who called this in? What's the situation?" I answered without a single tremor in my voice, though my hands were still cold. "I'm Claire Whitfield. I own this apartment. While I was out this afternoon, my husband and another woman entered that bedroom, and the door was locked from the outside by my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. I heard what sounded like someone in medical distress. I have strong reason to believe this entire scene was staged as a trap. There's a hidden camera set up in that room, and I did not open that door myself specifically because I did not want to walk into whatever's been arranged in there without witnesses present. I'm asking you to open it now, with all of you here." The officer's expression sharpened, all trace of routine dropping away. She nodded to the building's security guard, who stepped forward with a master key. The lock clicked open. A thick, cloying smell rolled out into the hallway the second the door swung open, something medicinal and sour underneath it. Not the smell of an affair at all, but the smell of a crime scene. What we found inside wasn't a cheating husband caught in some tawdry, ordinary betrayal. It was something far grimmer. Nathan was half-dressed, unconscious, slumped against the side of the bed in a pool of his own vomit. On the floor near the closet, a young woman I would later learn was named Dana was on her hands and knees, drenched in sweat, one hand clutching at her own chest, gasping in a way that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. Whatever had been in that relaxing drink Odette had described, it was doing something to her body that had nothing to do with jealousy or heartbreak, and everything to do with a hospital. The paramedics moved fast, kneeling beside Dana, fitting an oxygen mask over her face while one of them called out vitals to the other. The property manager, sharp-eyed even in the chaos, was scanning the room, and he stopped abruptly, pointing toward the dresser. "Officer, is that a camera behind that tissue box?" One of the officers pulled on a pair of gloves and lifted a small black device free of its hiding spot. The lens wasn't angled toward the bed at all, exactly as Odette had described. It was pointed precisely at the bedroom door, and a small red light on its side blinked steadily, still recording. Renee's face went the color of drywall. She stumbled back a step, bumping into the doorframe. The officer turned to her, voice hard now. "Whose camera is this?" I don't know. It's not mine." "That woman did it." Renee's voice cracked as she pointed straight at Odette, standing quietly a few feet back near the hallway. "She must have planted it. She's had it out for this family since the day she started working here." For a long, suspended second, nobody said anything. Then Odette, who had been watching the entire unraveling scene with the same steady, unreadable calm she brought to every stain she'd ever scrubbed out of my kitchen, reached into her apron pocket and pulled out an old flip phone, the kind you don't see much anymore. "Officer, I recorded a conversation a couple weeks back. I think you'll want to hear it." She pressed a button, and Renee's voice, unmistakable, tinny through the phone's small speaker but perfectly clear, filled the hallway. "Once she gets home and busts through that door acting crazy, this whole thing works itself out. We get her on camera, going off the rails, and if we threaten to send it to her job, she'll sign whatever we need her to sign just to make it go away." And then, right behind it, Estelle's voice, just as unmistakable. "That's right. We use this to break her down completely, get her to sign the house over to Nathan, bleed her dry if that's what it takes. The hallway had gone dead silent except for the low static hum of the flip phone's tiny speaker and Dana's ragged breathing behind the oxygen mask. Dana, being lifted onto the gurney, turned her head weakly toward Renee, eyes glassy but suddenly, furiously focused. That's the woman. She stole my phone. She told me it was to help me pay off what I owed. She never said anything about a camera. She never said anything about a husband, a wife, none of it. An officer went through Renee's bag while another kept a hand near her arm, and what came out of it made my stomach turn over slowly, piece by piece. Dana's own powered-off smartphone, taken so she couldn't call anyone or check messages during whatever window they'd needed her isolated. Photocopies of my driver's license, a copy of the property deed, and beneath all of that, a partially completed quitclaim deed transferring the condo into joint ownership with Nathan, with a signature on the line meant for me that was almost, but not quite, a convincing forgery of my handwriting. Beneath that, a home equity loan power of attorney, also bearing a forged version of my signature, dated 3 weeks earlier. Everyone standing in that hallway went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence before, heavier, more final. This had stopped being a messy family dispute somewhere along the way and had become something else entirely. Fraud, unlawful imprisonment, illegal recording, forgery of legal documents against an unconscious woman and an unwitting wife both. The officers arrested Renee on the spot. A second pair of officers, after a brief, tense conversation with their supervisor over radio, arrested Estelle as well, reading her rights while she was still sitting on the hallway floor where she'd collapsed earlier, for effect. As they clicked the handcuffs onto her wrists, Estelle spat words at me that I suspect she'd been saving up for exactly this moment, just in case. "You venomous woman. You've destroyed this entire family. Somebody up there is going to make you pay for this." I stood with my arms crossed, looking down at her without flinching. "No, Estelle. You and your son's greed destroyed this family. All I did was protect my home and my daughter." The rest of that evening dissolved into the particular blur that I imagine anyone who has ever called an ambulance to their own home knows well. Statements given twice, then a third time to a detective who arrived nearly an hour after everyone else. Dana loaded into the back of an ambulance, still barely conscious, on her way to a hospital where she'd spend the next 2 days recovering from whatever cocktail Renee had put in that drink. Nathan eventually stirring enough to be questioned by police right there in our bedroom, groggy and confused in a way that struck me, even then, as at least partially genuine. Whatever he had or hadn't understood about the full scope of his mother and sister's plan, he had clearly been drugged too, though far less severely than Dana had been. He kept repeating the same handful of words to anyone who'd listen. "I don't understand what happened. I don't remember agreeing to any of this." I believed that part for what it was worth. I did not believe it excused him. Sophie had been at a friend's house for a playdate that afternoon, thankfully, arranged weeks earlier and completely unrelated to anything that had unfolded. A small mercy I found myself unexpectedly grateful for amid everything else. Odette left the moment the police finished with her initial statement to go pick her up herself since I couldn't leave. And by the time I got home from the police station, well past 9 that night, Sophie was already asleep on the living room couch under a blanket, Odette sitting quietly in the armchair beside her, like a sentry who had decided, without being asked, that this particular post wasn't one she was willing to leave unmanned. I told her there'd been an accident and everyone was okay, Odette said quietly when I came in. I didn't think it was my place to say more than that. But ma'am, I want you to know I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you need from here on, you tell me. I sat down across from her and, for the first time since I'd stood outside that bedroom door with my hand on the knob, let myself cry. Not loudly, not for long. Just a slow, silent release of something I'd been holding rigid in my chest for hours. Odette didn't say anything else. She just reached over and put her weathered hand over mine, and we sat there together in the quiet living room while my daughter slept, until I finally had enough steadiness back in me to carry her to bed myself. The days that followed moved fast in some ways and impossibly slow in others. I filed for divorce within the week, with Priya handling everything, and requested a protective order against Nathan as a precaution while the investigation into exactly how much he'd known was still ongoing. My employer, when the story inevitably reached a few coworkers through the neighborhood grapevine, was unexpectedly kind about it. My supervisor pulled me aside not to reprimand me for the disruption, but to ask, quietly, if I needed time off, which told me more about the actual character of the people around me than months of dinner table politics ever had. The investigation moved through the system with a speed I hadn't expected. Dana, once she'd recovered enough to give a full statement, corroborated everything Odette had recorded and everything the police had found in Renee's bag. She'd been told, she said, that the debt Renee had helped connect her to Vance would be substantially reduced in exchange for what she genuinely believed was a fairly harmless, if sleazy, staged photo op. Nothing close to what actually happened once whatever was slipped into her drink hit her system. She was furious, understandably, and cooperative in a way that made the case against Renee airtight almost immediately. Vance himself, the man behind the original debt, eventually got swept up separately when detectives traced the loan network he'd been running out of that bar 2 towns over. Apparently, Renee and Dana weren't the only ones who'd found themselves cornered by him, and the case against him for unlicensed predatory lending opened up a much larger investigation that, as far as I know, is still working its way through the courts even now. Renee was charged with unlawful imprisonment, administering a substance to incapacitate another person, forgery, and identity theft. Facing that stack of charges with no money to hire her own attorney, she was assigned a public defender, and the plea deal she eventually accepted came with real prison time attached, not a slap on the wrist. Estelle's case moved differently. Her attorney argued, with some success, that her direct physical role in the scheme had been more limited than her daughter's, even though the recording Odette produced made it painfully clear how deeply involved in the planning she'd actually been. She avoided prison time in the end, sentenced instead to several years of probation given her age and lack of any prior record. But with both her son's marriage in ruins and her daughter facing prison, she packed up what she could carry and went back to her house in East Tennessee within the month. And as far as I know, none of us have heard from her since. Nathan's situation was, in its own way, the most complicated of all of them. Nathan was held for questioning far longer than I expected, given that he was, technically, also a victim of whatever had been in that drink. It turned out the detectives weren't just interested in what had happened that Tuesday afternoon. They wanted to know how much he'd known about the quitclaim deed slipped under the insurance folder back in March, how much he'd known about the debt Renee owed Vance, whether he'd been a knowing participant in the pressure campaign that had been building against me for the better part of a year, even if he hadn't known the specific details of that particular afternoon's staging. I went to see him once, at the county detention center, while all of that was still being sorted out. I told myself I went for closure. Looking back, I think some smaller, more stubborn part of me went because I needed to see with my own eyes, whether there was anything left in him worth being angry at, or whether the man I'd married had simply been worn down to nothing over the past year by two women he'd never once found the spine to stand up to. He looked smaller across that visitation glass than I remembered him being. His eyes red-rimmed, his hands pressed flat against the divider between us like that gesture alone could close the distance. Claire, this wasn't me. You have to believe me. It was all Mom and Renee's plan, start to finish. They sweet-talked me into thinking that if we just got the house into both our names, we could use it to pay off Renee's debt and nobody would ever have to know how bad it had gotten. I never wanted any of this to happen to you. I was just trying to protect my family. I looked at his desperate, tear-streaked face through that thick glass and waited for something in me to respond to it. Anger, grief, even a flicker of the old tenderness from the man who used to bring me soup in a paper bag on rainy nights. I found nothing, not even ash. Just a strange, flat quiet, the emotional equivalent of a closed account. Protecting your family, I said finally, would have meant telling your mother no the very first time she suggested putting your name on a deed for a house you never paid a cent toward. It would have meant standing between me and your sister the day she accused an innocent woman of theft in my living room. It would have meant asking one single question at any point in the last year about whether I was okay. You didn't protect anyone, Nathan. You just stood very still and let it happen, and hoped it would work out fine for everyone in the end. He didn't have an answer for that. I didn't wait around for one. I stood up, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, walking away from him didn't feel like losing anything at all. In the end, the $175,000 Renee had run up with Vance was legally recognized as her own separate debt, untouched by any part of my marriage or my finances. The condo, thanks to Priya's careful work, the documents sitting safely in that downtown safe deposit box, and 8 years of meticulous paperwork I'd kept precisely because meticulous was the only way I'd ever known how to survive, came through the entire ordeal completely, legally, untouched. Nathan was never charged as a co-conspirator. The detectives ultimately concluded, based on toxicology results and the timeline Odette's recording helped establish, that he'd likely been drugged without his knowledge shortly after arriving home that day, meant to be as incapacitated and confused as Dana when I finally walked in and found what they wanted me to find. Knowing that didn't make me feel much of anything toward him beyond a distant, clinical kind of pity. He may not have built the trap, but he'd spent a year quietly clearing the path for the people who did. The divorce itself moved through the courts with far less drama than I expected, mostly because there was almost nothing left to fight over. I kept the condo, obviously, since it had never legally been anything but mine. I got full custody of Sophie, with Nathan granted supervised visitation that, as of this writing, he has used exactly twice. I wish I could say that the moment those handcuffs closed around Estelle's wrists, the fear simply evaporated and life snapped back into its old shape. It didn't work that way. For weeks afterward, I'd startle awake in the middle of the night, convinced I'd heard the bedroom door creak, even though I'd had the locks changed the very next morning, and the old bedroom furniture hauled out entirely, replaced with a second-hand set I found through a listing online, because I couldn't stand the idea of sleeping in a room that had held that particular memory inside it. Sophie struggled too, in her own 8-year-old way. She'd overheard enough fragments from adults around the building, enough hushed conversation between me and Priya on the phone, to understand that something frightening had happened, even if the full shape of it stayed appropriately blurred for her. For a couple of months, she wanted the hallway light left on at night, something she hadn't needed since she was 5. I found a child therapist through a recommendation from her school counselor, a warm, patient woman named Dr. Whitcomb, who specialized in kids navigating family upheaval, and Sophie saw her every other week through the rest of that spring and into the summer. Slowly, in the unhurried way that these things actually heal, instead of the fast, tidy way movies like to show it, she came back to herself. By August, she was sleeping with the light off again, and by the time school started back up in the fall, she'd stopped flinching every time she heard raised voices on the television. Odette, in the meantime, had become something closer to a fixture in our lives than an employee. A few weeks after everything settled, I sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where Estelle had once told me a couple who divides everything up so neatly isn't a couple, and told her I wanted to increase her hours and her pay substantially if she was willing. She studied me for a long moment before answering. "Ma'am, I appreciate that, but can I ask you something honest?" "Of course." "Why me? There's plenty of women in this city who clean houses. I'm not owed anything special just because I happened to be standing in the hallway that day." I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because you stood in front of me that day with a strength I still don't fully understand. And you'd already been standing quietly in my corner for months before that, keeping track of things nobody asked you to keep track of, just because you thought it was right. I don't think that's a small thing, Odette. I think that's most of what family actually is, when you strip away the bloodline part of it." Her eyes went bright, and she looked down at her hands for a moment before nodding. Once, firmly, the way she did everything. "Well, then I suppose I'm not going anywhere." She started coming 5 days a week instead of 2, and somewhere along the way, without either of us ever formally announcing it, she stopped feeling like staff and started feeling like the aunt Sophie had never actually had. She taught Sophie how to can tomatoes from the little balcony plants, a skill I doubt will ever be strictly useful in downtown Nashville, but that Sophie treasures anyway. She started leaving little notes in Sophie's lunchbox on the morning she came early enough to pack it, small looping cursive reminding her to eat her vegetables and that she was loved. When Odette's own son called from 3 states away, which he did most Sundays, she'd sometimes put him on speakerphone in the kitchen, and Sophie would chatter at him about her school day like he was an uncle she'd known her whole life. I want to be honest about something else, too, because I think it matters for anyone reading this who's been through something similar and is waiting to feel like themselves again. I didn't magically stop being guarded. If anything, the whole ordeal sharpened that part of me rather than softening it. I still read every document twice before I sign it. I still keep copies of important paperwork somewhere outside my own house. I still, if I'm honest, feel my stomach tighten slightly whenever an in-law type, anyone's in-law, not just my own former one, starts a sentence with, "When you're really family, you'll understand." I don't think that wariness is a flaw I need to apologize for or work through in therapy of my own. I think it's a form of the exact patience my mother warned me about from her hospital bed all those years ago. The kind that doesn't crush itself down to nothing just to keep a room comfortable. I heard from Dana again about 2 months after that Tuesday afternoon, in a way I hadn't expected. A handwritten letter showed up in my mailbox, no return address, just my name and unit number in careful, slightly uneven handwriting. She wrote that she'd spent a long time not sure whether she had any right to reach out to me at all, given everything. Given that she'd walked into my home and my bedroom, however unknowingly, as part of a scheme built to destroy my life. She wanted me to know she was in outpatient treatment now, working with a counselor, and that Vance's arrest, the larger investigation that had spun out of Renee's case, had led to her own debt being wiped clean as part of the fraud proceedings against him, since a judge had determined the original loan itself violated state lending laws 6 ways from Sunday. She said she thought about that afternoon constantly, replaying the moment she'd agreed to Renee's offer. wondering what would have happened to her if I hadn't called an ambulance instead of throwing that door open the way they'd planned for me to. She didn't think, she wrote, that she would have survived much longer in that room if things had gone the way Renee and Estelle intended. At the very bottom, in slightly smaller handwriting, like she'd debated including it at all, "Thank you for calling 911 instead of opening the door. I know you didn't do it for me. I don't think it matters. I'm still here because of it." I sat with that letter at my kitchen table for a long time. I never wrote back, not because I didn't want to, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say to a woman whose worst day had become permanently tangled up with mine through no real fault of either of ours. Eventually, months later, we did meet once at a coffee shop near her apartment at her request, and it was awkward in the particular way two strangers bonded by trauma tend to be awkward. Too much shared history, not nearly enough shared context. We didn't become friends exactly, but we check in with each other maybe twice a year now, a text around the holidays, nothing more. And somehow that feels like exactly the right amount of closeness for what we actually are to each other. Two women who happen to survive the same afternoon from two very different rooms in the same story. Work, strangely, became one of the steadiest parts of my life in the months that followed. My manager, true to the kindness she'd shown in those first raw days, quietly made sure I wasn't handed anything unmanageable while I was juggling court dates and Sophie's therapy appointments. And by the following spring, I was promoted to a senior manager role overseeing the whole accounting team, the kind of promotion that had felt, for years, permanently out of reach while I was spending all my emotional bandwidth managing a household that didn't want to be managed by me at all. I found, once the constant background noise of that apartment had gone quiet, that I actually had a great deal of energy left over for the parts of my life I'd been neglecting without even realizing it. The building itself, in its own small way, closed ranks around me too. A few of the neighbors who'd poked their heads out into the hallway that Tuesday afternoon turned out to be kinder than I expected. An older couple, 2 doors down, started leaving a covered dish on our doormat every couple of weeks that fall. No note, no expectation of thanks, just a quiet gesture from people who'd clearly pieced together enough of what happened to want to do something about it in the only language they had. Mr. Castellano, the property manager, personally walked me through upgrading the building's entry security after everything, waiving the installation fee for a second deadbolt on my unit without my having to ask. Priya became less of an attorney and more of a genuine friend over that year, the two of us meeting for coffee every few weeks even after the legal side of things had fully wrapped up, less to discuss paperwork and more just to sit across from each other and talk like the college students we used to be, before either of us had mortgages or custody agreements or clients who'd tried to forge our signatures. She was the one, actually, who eventually convinced me to start dating again, nearly a year and a half after the divorce was finalized. Nothing serious yet, nothing I feel any particular need to write about here, just coffee with a man from her firm's building who made me laugh in a way I hadn't expected to laugh again for a long while. I mention it not because it's the point of this story, but because I think it matters to say plainly that the story doesn't end in the hallway with those handcuffs. Life kept moving. It just moved differently than it would have if I'd opened that door. People sometimes ask me, when they learn the outline of this story, whether I regret the years I spent trying so hard to be the accommodating one, the daughter-in-law who bit her tongue over the vase, who let the deed conversation slide the first 3 times it came up, who told herself an old woman's cutting remarks were just old-fashioned thinking that didn't need to be taken seriously. I understand why they ask. From the outside, all that patience can look like it just delayed the inevitable. Like if I'd drawn a hard line on day 1 over the deed, None of the rest of it. Renee, Milo, the plate, the necklace, the trap, would have had room to happen at all. I don't see it that way, and I don't think I ever will. My mother didn't tell me, from that hospital bed, not to be patient. She told me not to let my patience get so large that it swallowed my own basic right to be treated decently. Those are two very different instructions, and it took me most of a marriage to understand the actual distance between them. Patience, real patience, isn't the same thing as silence. It isn't the same thing as making yourself smaller and smaller in your own home until there's nothing left of you for anyone to bump into. I was patient with Estelle because I genuinely believed for a long time that warmth might eventually be met with warmth. I was patient with Renee because I could see a frightened child standing behind her, and I couldn't make myself punish him for his mother's choices. Neither of those things were mistakes. What was a mistake, the only real mistake I made in that entire year, was mistaking my husband's silence for neutrality. Neutrality doesn't exist inside a marriage the way people like to pretend it does. When one person is quietly building a case against you at the dinner table every single night, and the person who's supposed to be standing beside you just keeps eating his dinner and asking everyone to let it go, that isn't him staying out of it. That's him choosing a side. He was just hoping nobody, including himself, would ever have to say so out loud. I think about the version of that Tuesday afternoon where Odette wasn't standing in the hallway, where I threw that door open exactly the way they wanted, camera rolling, and stood there screaming at a scene designed to look exactly like the thing that would destroy me. I think about what that footage would have looked like, edited down to 30 seconds and sent to my employer, to Sophie's school, to every neighbor in that building who'd already half decided, over months of overheard hallway arguments, that the wife upstairs was probably the difficult one. I think about how easy it would have been for them to make me look unstable, when in reality, I had never once, in the entire ordeal, raised my voice louder than the ordinary volume of a woman asking for a place setting at her own dinner table. That's the part of this story that still sits heaviest with me, honestly. Not the drug, not the forged deed, not even Estelle's parting curse in that hallway. It's how close I came to becoming exactly the woman they'd already decided to paint me as, simply by reacting the way any normal, frightened, blindsided person would have reacted to strange breathing behind a locked bedroom door. If I'd given in to that first instinct, the completely human, completely understandable instinct to fling that door open and demand answers, I would have handed them everything they needed. Instead, because one woman in that hallway had already decided, months earlier, that my kindness toward her was worth returning, I had just enough warning to choose differently. I don't know what I would have done in Odette's position if our roles had been reversed. I'd like to think I would have grabbed the wrist of the woman about to walk into a trap too. But I also know how easy it is, when you're the housekeeper, the outsider, the person with the least power in a room full of people who could end your employment with a single phone call, to decide that staying quiet is the safer choice. Odette didn't choose the safer choice. She chose the right one, at real personal risk. And I will be paying that particular debt back for the rest of my life, in whatever small ways I'm able to. That September, Sophie turned 9, and I threw her a small birthday party out on the shared courtyard behind our building. Nothing extravagant, just balloons zip-tied to the railing, a sheet cake from the same bakery where I'd bought that anniversary cake I never got to eat, and a handful of her classmates running around in the last warm evening of the season. It was the first genuinely happy, uncomplicated gathering our little family had hosted in over a year. And standing there, watching Sophie blow out 9 candles with Odette's hand resting warm on her shoulder, I found myself thinking, unexpectedly, of Estelle. Not with anger exactly. By that point, most of the anger had burned itself down to something quieter, more like the ash my mother's memory always seemed to leave behind rather than an open flame. I thought about the woman who'd stood in that same doorway a year and a half earlier, beaming at the guest room I decorated for her, saying, "My daughter-in-law has such good taste." I wondered whether that version of Estelle had ever been entirely real, or whether she'd always been capable of exactly what she eventually did, just waiting for the right combination of debt and desperation to bring it fully to the surface. I don't think I'll ever have a satisfying answer to that question, and I've mostly made peace with not needing one. Some people show you their whole selves slowly, in careful, deliberate installments, and by the time you've seen the full picture, you're already standing in the middle of it. Milo, I should say, is the one person from that whole chapter of my life I still think about with something closer to uncomplicated tenderness than anything else. He was 7 years old, and none of what happened was remotely his fault. Not the necklace, not the debt, not the trap his mother and grandmother built in a bedroom down the hall from where he was probably watching cartoons, oblivious. I heard, secondhand, through Priya, that he ended up living with his father for a while after Renee's sentencing, and then eventually with an aunt on his father's side once that arrangement didn't work out. I think about him sometimes, that small boy clutching a rain-soaked stuffed dinosaur on the worst night of his short life so far, and I hope, genuinely, that wherever he landed, somebody in that house is setting a full plate for him at every single meal. Neighbors talked, of course, in the way that neighbors in any building eventually do, about the loudest thing that's ever happened on their floor. For a few weeks that spring, I could feel eyes on me in the elevator, hear the particular hush that falls over a conversation when the subject of it steps into the lobby. I won't pretend that was easy. But it faded faster than I expected, mostly because the actual facts of what happened, an elaborate criminal scheme uncovered by careful evidence rather than a marriage that simply fell apart in some ordinary, forgettable way, didn't leave much room for the usual gossip to take hold. There wasn't really a version of the story where I came out looking like the villain, once people understood what had actually been in that folder Renee's bag, and what had actually been on that camera behind the tissue box. If anything, several of the women in my building started treating me with a kind of wary, careful respect I hadn't had from them before. The specific respect people reserve for someone who turned out to be tougher and more clear-headed under pressure than anyone had given her credit for. I ran into Nathan exactly once after the divorce was finalized, almost a year later, entirely by accident, in the parking lot of a hardware store on the west side of the city. He looked older than the calendar accounted for, thinner, a little gray starting at his temples that hadn't been there before, dressed in the same kind of work clothes he'd always worn, but somehow wearing them differently now, like a man who'd lost the easy confidence that used to come with them. He saw me before I saw him, and by the time I noticed him standing near the loading dock with a coil of wire over one shoulder, it was too late to pretend I hadn't. We stood there for an awkward moment. The particular kind of awkward reserved for people who used to share a bed and a mortgage and now share nothing but a court file. "You look good, Claire," he said finally. "Sophie doing okay?" "She's doing great. 4th grade this year. She's really into swimming." He nodded, and something in his face flickered. Regret, maybe. Or just the specific ache of hearing details about your own child's life secondhand, in a parking lot, from the woman you used to know everything about. I think about reaching out more, to see her, I mean. I don't know what I'd even say to her at this point. I thought about telling him that not knowing what to say had never once stopped him from staying silent at exactly the moments it mattered most, and that this seemed like a strange time to suddenly develop a conscience about it. I didn't say that. There didn't seem to be much point anymore in trying to make him understand something that a year of court dates and a stint in a holding cell apparently hadn't managed to teach him. She'd probably like a birthday card, I said instead. That's a low bar, Nathan. You could start there. He nodded again, said something about maybe doing that, and we went our separate ways into the store. I never heard whether the card actually came. If it did, it wasn't sent to an address Sophie would have recognized as home, and by the time I'm writing this, she's stopped asking about him with any real regularity, not with bitterness, just the quiet, matter-of-fact acceptance kids eventually settle into when an adult who was supposed to be a fixture in their life simply isn't one anymore. I think, more than anything else that happened in that parking lot, what stayed with me afterward was how little I felt. I'd spent so many months bracing for the moment I might run into him again, rehearsing things I might say, imagining the flood of anger or grief or nostalgia that seemed like it ought to accompany a scene like that. Instead, I just felt tired, mildly, the way you feel after a long meeting that could have been an email. Some endings don't come with fireworks. Some of them just quietly confirm that the version of the person you fell in love with was, in fact, gone long before the paperwork made it official. I've tried in the time since to be deliberate about what I teach Sophie from all of this, without turning her childhood into a cautionary tale she didn't ask to carry. I don't want her growing up believing that every extended family is secretly plotting against her, or that kindness toward difficult people is inherently foolish. I still believe, even now, that opening our home to Estelle in the first place wasn't wrong on its face. That impulse toward generosity is one of the better parts of who I am, and I'm not interested in surgically removing it just because two people took catastrophic advantage of it once. What I do want Sophie to understand, the same lesson my own mother tried to hand me from a hospital bed years before Sophie was even born, is the difference between generosity and disappearance. That you can set a full table for someone without letting them convince you that you don't deserve a seat at it. That love and boundaries were never actually opposites, no matter how many people in that old apartment insisted otherwise. I started quietly, teaching her the basics of money, the way my own mother never quite got the chance to teach me before she died. Not in a heavy, anxious way, but in small, ordinary moments. A savings jar on her dresser, a conversation, age-appropriate, about why the deed to our home has only my name on it and what that actually means, framed not as a warning about marriage, but as a simple fact about protecting the things you build with your own two hands. She's 9. Most of it probably goes over her head for now. But I remember exactly how old I was when my own mother first explained the concept of separate property to me at the kitchen table, using our own modest apartment as the example. And I remember that it mattered more, later, than either of us could have known at the time. Renee's sentencing hearing took place on a gray morning in late October, almost 6 months to the day after that Tuesday afternoon, and I made myself go. Mostly for the same reason I'd made myself read every line of that insurance folder, because I'd learned, the hard way, that not looking directly at something never actually made it smaller. She looked different in the courtroom than she had in my kitchen, in my hallway, in every version of her I'd carried around in my head since that day. Smaller somehow. Dressed in the plain clothes the county provided, her hair pulled back without the effort she used to put into it. When the judge read out the plea agreement, 3 years, with the possibility of parole after serving a portion of that, on the unlawful imprisonment and forgery charges, running alongside a separate sentence for the substance charge related to Dana, Renee didn't look at me once. She kept her eyes fixed somewhere on the table in front of her, and I found myself, unexpectedly, not needing her to. I'd spent months in the quiet moments right before sleep, imagining what I might say to her if I ever got the chance. Some perfectly composed indictment of everything she'd taken from me. Some sentence sharp enough to finally make her understand the size of what she'd tried to do. Sitting in that courtroom, watching her get let out afterward by a bailiff, hands cuffed in front of her instead of behind, I realized I didn't actually have anything left that I needed to say to her. Whatever closure I'd been waiting for hadn't been sitting in that courtroom at all. It had already happened, months earlier, in a hallway, the moment I chose to dial 911 instead of a doorknob. Milo wasn't in the courtroom that day, which I was glad of. Whatever this story ends up meaning to him someday, when he's old enough to piece it together in full, I hope it reaches him slowly, gently, from people who love him, rather than crashing down on him all at once the way it crashed down on me. Estelle's probation hearing had happened a few weeks earlier, and I hadn't attended that one at all. Priya went in my place, mostly to confirm the terms on my behalf. No contact with me or Sophie, a restriction I doubt Estelle had any real intention of violating, given how quickly and completely she'd disappeared back into rural Tennessee the moment the handcuffs came off. I heard, through the same secondhand channels that occasionally still carried word from that old life, that she'd moved in with a cousin, that her health wasn't what it used to be, that she rarely left the house anymore. I didn't feel triumphant hearing any of that. Mostly, I just felt the particular unglamorous relief of a chapter finally, completely closing. The kind of relief that doesn't come with fireworks so much as with the simple, physical sensation of your shoulders dropping half an inch you didn't realize they'd been holding. That winter, Odette's son came to visit for the first time since I'd known her. A quiet, thoughtful man in his late 20s who worked in shipping logistics somewhere out near the coast, and who spent an entire evening at our kitchen table listening to Sophie explain, in exhaustive detail, the entire plot of whatever animated show she was obsessed with that month, nodding along with a patience that reminded me powerfully of his mother. Watching the two of them together, watching Odette's face soften in a way I rarely saw except around Sophie, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself consider before. That the family I'd ended up building, almost entirely by accident, out of the wreckage of the one I thought I'd married into, was, in its own way, sturdier and more honest than the original had ever managed to be, even at its best moments, even before anyone had said a single cruel word at that dinner table. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house once real danger has actually passed, as opposed to the false, brittle quiet that sits over a house where danger is only pretending to have passed, waiting patiently in the walls for its next opening. I didn't fully understand the difference between those two kinds of silence until I'd lived inside both of them. The first kind, the fake peace of that year with Estelle and Renee, the years of my mother's warning slowly proving itself true one dinner at a time, always had a faint hum underneath it, a low-grade vigilance I carried in my shoulders and my jaw without ever consciously noticing I was carrying it. The second kind, the real kind, the kind that finally settled over our apartment sometime that second winter after the divorce, felt almost unfamiliar at first. I remember standing in the kitchen one ordinary Tuesday evening, chopping vegetables for dinner with nothing on the stove yet, no one waiting at the table to critique the seasoning, no undercurrent of calculation running beneath the surface of the room, and realizing I'd forgotten, for the length of one entire evening, to brace myself for anything at all. It felt less like relief, and more like an entire limb I hadn't realized had gone numb, slowly waking back up, pins and needles and all. I went back to therapy myself that spring, something I'd resisted doing even while sending Sophie to Dr. Whitcomb every other week, telling myself I was the adult in the situation, and adults were supposed to be the ones holding things together, rather than falling apart in someone else's office. My therapist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Renner who specialized in trauma related to financial abuse and coercive control within families, was the first person who ever used that specific phrase to describe what I'd lived through: coercive control. And hearing it named that plainly, in a clinical, unemotional voice, did something for me that no amount of venting to Priya over coffee ever quite managed. It turned a year of feeling vaguely, indefinably crazy into something with an actual shape, a recognized pattern, a name other people had lived through and survived and had a whole professional vocabulary built around. I hadn't been overreacting to a missing plate at a dinner table. I had been living, for the better part of a year, inside a slow, deliberate campaign designed to make me feel small enough, tired enough, and isolated enough that signing away my own house would eventually start to feel like the path of least resistance. Understanding that didn't erase what had happened, but it did something almost as valuable. It stopped me from spending the rest of my life quietly wondering whether I'd somehow brought it on myself by being too rigid about the deed, too unwilling to compromise, too much of an accountant about the whole thing, exactly the way Renee used to sneer at me across that dinner table. I hadn't been too rigid. I had been, if anything, far too patient for far too long, exactly as my mother had warned me I might be, and the only real mistake in the whole arrangement had been believing that patience would eventually be recognized and repaid in kind, instead of simply mined for whatever it could be made to yield. Spring turned into another summer, and Sophie's swim season ended with a small trophy she displayed proudly on her dresser next to a photo of my mother that I'd given her the year before. A woman she never got to meet, standing on a beach somewhere in the 90s, squinting into the sun with an expression Sophie insists, and I privately agree, looks exactly like my own when I'm trying not to laugh at something inappropriate. I've started telling Sophie more stories about her grandmother lately. Small ones, the kind that don't require much context. The way she used to hum while she cooked. The particular sternness she reserved only for people who mistreated waitstaff. The hospital bed conversation about patience that I've now told my daughter enough times that she can recite the important part back to me nearly word for word. I don't know exactly what Sophie will carry forward from any of this. Which parts will stick and which will simply become background noise from a childhood she's too young yet to fully process. But I hope, if nothing else, that the phrase makes it through intact. Don't let your patience get so big that people forget you're allowed to be treated decently. I think often about the exact moment everything could have gone differently. Not the big, obvious turning point of the hallway, but a much smaller one, months earlier, the night Odette first told me she was thinking of resigning after the necklace incident. If I hadn't stopped washing dishes long enough to actually look at her, if I'd let her walk out that door still believing my family, because that's what they were being presented as, even to her, even after everything, had chosen convenience over her dignity, none of what came afterward would have unfolded the way it did. There would have been no one in that hallway that Tuesday afternoon to grab my wrist. I would have opened that door exactly the way I was meant to, and the woman writing this sentence right now might not exist at all. Might have been replaced entirely by whatever broken, discredited version of me they'd have manufactured out of 30 seconds of hidden camera footage and a well-timed threat to my employer. It unsettles me, sometimes, how much of a life can pivot on a single choice that felt, in the moment, almost too small to matter. Whether to believe a housekeeper over a sister-in-law, whether to stand physically between an accusation and the person it was aimed at, whether to treat a woman who cleaned my floors as someone whose word carried the same weight as anyone else's in that house. I didn't do any of that because I had some grand strategic sense that I was building an alliance I might need later. I did it because it was the plainly decent thing to do. And I'd like to think I'd have done it even if none of the rest of this story had ever happened. Even if Estelle and Renee's plan had simply fizzled out on its own for lack of opportunity. But I'd be lying if I said I don't think about that thread sometimes, tracing it all the way back. How the entire shape of my survival ended up resting on a decision I made not out of calculation, but out of the same basic instinct my mother spent her whole life trying to instill in me. Treat people decently, even when, especially when, it costs you something to do it. There's a version of this story, the version Renee and Estelle were counting on, where being the careful one, the accounting one, the woman who reads every document twice and keeps copies in a safe deposit box downtown, gets rewritten as coldness, as an inability to simply relax and let family be family. I used to worry, a little, that they were right about that part, even while I disagreed with everything else. I don't worry about it anymore. Being careful is not the same thing as being cold. It turns out that the careful, meticulous, slightly all-businesswoman everyone in that old apartment loved to roll their eyes at was the exact same woman who kept a paper trail thorough enough to protect an innocent employee from a false accusation, thorough enough to keep her own home out of a con man's hands, thorough enough to walk into a courtroom and watch justice actually land instead of quietly dissolving into he said, she said. I'll take that particular reputation over whatever warmer, softer version of myself they were trying to talk me into becoming. I don't think that version would have survived the year I actually lived through. There's one more person from that year I haven't given proper credit to yet. Mostly because her role in all of it happened so quietly that I almost forgot to mention her at all when I first started putting the story into words. A coworker named Grace Ibarra, who sat 2 desks down from me in the accounting department and who, without ever once asking for details I wasn't ready to give, simply started covering for me in a dozen small ways during the worst months of that ordeal. I never told Grace the specifics of what was happening at home. I couldn't have, not without unraveling completely at my desk in the middle of a workday. And I'd built my entire professional identity around never being the woman who unraveled at her desk. But Grace was observant in the particular way good accountants tend to be. The same instinct that catches a discrepancy buried 3 columns deep in a spreadsheet apparently also catches a coworker who stopped eating lunch, who flinches every time her phone buzzes, who started coming in 20 minutes early just to sit in her car in the parking garage before she can make herself walk inside. She never pushed. She just started quietly rearranging things so I had room to fall apart a little without anyone above us noticing. She'd take the client calls on days I clearly couldn't manage my voice. She covered 2 full days for me, no questions asked, the week I had to give my initial statement to the detective handling the case, telling our manager only that I had a family emergency, which was, if anything, an almost comically restrained way of describing what was actually happening. The day after everything came out into the open, after the arrests, after the story had started making its slow way around the building through whatever channels these things travel, Grace found me alone in the break room and didn't say anything about it directly at all. She just set a coffee down in front of me, the way I'd always taken it, and said, "I'm really glad you're okay, Claire. That's all. You don't have to talk about any of it if you don't want to." Then she sat with me in silence for the length of that entire coffee, which was somehow exactly the right amount of acknowledgement and exactly the right amount of restraint. The kind of quiet, undemanding presence I hadn't realized I'd been starving for the whole time I was carefully managing everyone else's comfort in that apartment. I think about Grace sometimes when I think about all the people who showed up for me in ways too small to make it into the dramatic parts of this story. Not the police, not the courtroom. None of the parts with sirens or handcuffs, but the ordinary, unglamorous kindness of a coworker sliding a coffee across a table and simply saying, "I'm glad you're okay." I don't think survival, in situations like mine, is ever really built out of one single decisive moment. It's built out of a dozen small ones stacked on top of each other. Odette's hand on my wrist, Priya's voice telling me to read every document twice, Grace's coffee, Sophie sliding her omelet onto my plate even though I always slid it right back. None of those moments on their own would have been enough to save me. All of them together, quietly accumulating over the better part of a year, turned out to be exactly enough. Almost 2 years to the day after I stood outside that bedroom door with my hand an inch from the knob, I hosted a small dinner in the condo. The same condo, still standing, still legally and completely mine, though it looks almost nothing like it did during that year Estelle and Renee lived in it. The blue glass vase is back on the dining table, the one that got quietly put away because it was in the way. The mismatched thrift store mugs are back in the front of the cabinet where I can reach them without thinking about it. I repainted the guest room, the one Renee and Milo slept in, a soft, unremarkable gray, and it's a home office now, where I sometimes work late into the evening without a single knot in my stomach about who's listening on the other side of the door. It was a Sunday, unremarkable in every way except that it wasn't. The late afternoon light came in gold and low across the kitchen floor, the way it does in Nashville in early autumn, and the whole apartment smelled like the roast chicken I'd put in hours earlier. The same dish that used to get portioned out so carefully to exclude me at that same table. Only now there was more than enough for everyone, because there was no one left in the house who believed food was a currency you had to earn. Sophie set the table herself, carefully, the way she'd started doing without being asked sometime that spring. 4 places instead of the usual 3, because Priya had come by for dinner that night too, still in her work clothes, still complaining good-naturedly about a difficult opposing counsel on an unrelated case. More sister to me by then than friend. Odette stood at the stove finishing the gravy, humming something under her breath the way she always did when she cooked, a habit Sophie had picked up without either of them noticing, so that sometimes I'd catch the two of them humming the same unplaceable tune in different rooms of the house, like some kind of accidental duet. "Mom, this is for you." Sophie appeared at my elbow, holding out a plate she'd made up herself, heaping a little too much mashed potato onto it in her enthusiasm. "I made sure you got the good piece of chicken, the one with the crispy skin, because that's your favorite." I looked down at that plate for a long moment. An ordinary plate, ordinary chicken, nothing remarkable about it at all, except for the simple, uncomplicated fact that someone at this table had thought of me first, without being asked, without any calculation about what it would cost her to be generous. I thanked her and pulled out my chair. And around that table, the conversation turned to nothing important at all. Sophie's swim times, a case Priya was arguing next month, whether Odette's tomato plants would survive one more frost before we needed to bring them in for the winter. Ordinary, unremarkable, blessedly boring conversation. The kind I used to watch other families have through elevator doors and restaurant windows, and think, with an ache I couldn't name at the time, that I might never get to have myself. At some point during dinner, Sophie reached over and rested her small hand on top of mine. the way she used to when she was younger and worried I might disappear if she stopped touching me long enough. I don't think she was worried about that anymore. I think, by then, she had simply learned it as a habit of affection rather than a habit of fear, the way children eventually learn to separate the two once they've watched enough evidence pile up that the fear was never actually necessary in this particular house, at this particular table. I let myself cry a little, quietly, in the middle of that ordinary Sunday dinner, and nobody at the table made a production of it. Odette reached over without a word and refilled my water glass. Priya kept talking about her difficult opposing counsel like nothing had happened. Sophie just squeezed my hand a little tighter and kept eating her potatoes. It wasn't grief. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's easy to assume, from the outside, that any tears at the end of a story like this one must be leftover sadness finally working its way to the surface. It wasn't that. It was something closer to what I imagine it feels like to set down a weight you've been carrying for so long you'd forgotten your shoulders were ever meant to hang any other way. The strange, almost disorienting relief of finally being able to take one full, unguarded breath at my own table, in my own home, surrounded by the people who had actually earned the right to sit there. My mother told me, from a hospital bed I still think about more often than I let myself admit, that a wife has to learn patience, but never so much patience that she forgets she's allowed to be treated decently. I understand now, in a way I couldn't have at 27, sitting beside her holding her thin, papery hand and thinking she was only talking about marriage, that she wasn't just talking about marriage at all. She was talking about every room I would ever walk into for the rest of my life, every family, chosen or otherwise, every table I would ever be invited to sit at. Patience is not the same thing as disappearing. Kindness is not the same thing as forfeiting your own name from the deed to your own life. Sometimes, late at night, after Sophie's asleep and Odette has gone home to her own small apartment across town, I sit at that kitchen table by myself, with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, and I think about all the women who never got the version of that Tuesday afternoon that I got. The ones without a housekeeper willing to grab their wrist, without a college friend who happened to become a family law attorney, without the specific, unglamorous stubbornness that comes from spending your whole career reconciling numbers that refuse to lie. I think about how much of what saved me wasn't really about being smarter or stronger than Estelle and Renee. It was about the accumulated luck of having, at exactly the right moment, exactly the right people standing nearby, willing to do something small and inconvenient and possibly costly to themselves on my behalf. I don't know how to turn that into a tidy lesson for anyone else living through their own version of that year. I only know that if there's a woman out there right now, standing in her own hallway, feeling the particular cold that comes from being slowly starved out of a home that legally, undeniably belongs to her, I hope somebody grabs her wrist too. I hope she has in Odette. And if she doesn't yet, I hope she learns, the way I eventually did, to trust the small, quiet voice in the back of her own mind that keeps insisting something is wrong, long before she has any proof at all. I kept my house. I kept my daughter. I kept, against every calculated effort to strip it away from me, the quiet, unglamorous, hard-won certainty that I had never once, in any of it, been the difficult one. And on a gold-lit Sunday evening 2 years later, at a table set for 4 instead of 6, in a home that finally, fully, belonged only to the people who deserved to be there, I ate the good piece of chicken my daughter picked out for me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't have to wonder whether there would be a plate waiting for me at all.